Hi everyone, welcome back. So we're going to go ahead and start working on our CAD model. And in order to do that, the first thing we're going to do is actually bring in the sketch that we did from before. So I took a screenshot of it earlier, and I'm going to go ahead and insert it so that we have something to reference. I'm going to go ahead and leave it here off to the side because I don't really want it to interfere with my main drawing. So I'm going to set it there. And so now we have our drawing that we can work off of. So like most things in Fusion, what we're actually going to try to do is start with a sketch. We're going to extrude that sketch into a solid, and then we're going to modify that solid further to get the full geometry on the part that we want. So let's go ahead and start with the basics. We're going to start with a basic outline of our waffle knob and just sort of like work on getting the geometry of the base and the pointer to what we want it to be. So let's start with our sketch. Again, I want to work on my XY plane. That brings me to this orthogonal view, which is nice, and I can start drawing. So I'm going to start with our circle. I'm going to use my origin as the base, right? Typically, when we're working parametrically, we don't want to necessarily specify all these dimensions up front because obviously we can get a little too constrained. However, because I already know what dimensions this is going to be, I'm going to just go ahead and set it. That way we can have it set and sort of like forget it, or just sort of set it for now so that we have what we're working with, right? So it's 28 millimeters. We're going to leave it at that. Of course, because it is parametric, if I want to, I can always go back and sort of change this if I need to, right? But because we know what the dimensions are, we're going to go ahead and leave it at that. The next thing I'm going to work off is just making this pointer. So I'm going to actually start off with a reference line, right? Because everything is going to be symmetrical, I actually need this. I actually just want a reference line just to help me sort of like keep things organized, right? And so right now, this line is actually set as a normal line. I'm going to change this to a center line. That way I can use it, I can reference it, but it doesn't sort of necessarily get in the way of my geometry, which is exactly what I want. So right now, there's a couple of different constraints that are applied to this, right? So there's this vertical constraint, so this keeps it sort of straight up and down. And there should be a coincident sort of like constraint to keep it sort of attached to the circle. So if I move this back, and you can see that I can still move this back and forth, right? And so that's great if that's what you want to do. But for what I'm trying to do is I want to make sure that this stays in line with my center point. So I'm going to add one more constraint here. And I'm going to make these all sort of coincident to each other. That way, now that they are coincident to each other, I won't be able to move these things back and forth, right? So that stays in line with one another, which is exactly what I want. Okay, so with that being said and with that being done, I can add the one length or one arm of my pointer. Again, I'm going to snap it to my point here because so that I have that as a point that it's going to refer to. And then I'm also going to snap or coincident to this circle because I want to make sure that it follows that circle regardless of what dimensions I end up changing it to be. And so there we go. So again, you can see by now I can sort of change this up and down. I can move this back and forth and it'll stay sort of attached to the circle, which is exactly what I want for my pointer. What I do to one side, I want to do to the other side. So this is part of why we have the center line. I'm going to select my line. I'm going to mirror it. I'm going to select the mirror line that I want. And there we go. Now I have a perfectly mirrored pointer, which again, you can see they added a bunch of sort of like automatic constraints for me so that if I start to move these points back and forth, it automatically keeps it all in place for us, right? Which is great. We could just sort of leave it at that and sort of be done. But there's a few more things that I actually want to do just to give me a few more settings and sort of give me a little bit more control of what I'm happening. Sure, again, I can just sort of go back and sort of like adjust these things by eye if I wanted to, which is perfectly fine for if that's what you want to do. But I want to try to add a few more features to this to just give me a little bit more control, right? So the first thing that I want to be able to do is actually I want to be able to control the height, or I want to specify the height, and I also want to be able to specify the width of these things. So what I'm going to do is add another measurement constraint here, right? So that allows me to then specify exactly what dimension I want there. I also want to specify the width, and so now I can go back and again sort of adjust it. Adjust it based on exactly how high, how tall, or how wide I want this to be, right? And make those sort of adjustments as we go along, okay? One more thing that we're going to do before we extrude this. Right here, we have these very sharp points. For the most part, again, because this is a relatively small part, it's probably not going to matter that much. But typically, I do like to fillet all these corners because it just makes the geometry a little bit nicer to work with, right? So what I'm going to do in order to actually fillet that, I actually need to trim this part out. That way it knows where to sort of like start and begin that fillet. So I'm going to break this circle into a couple parts there, and change that and break that. And so now we have these two pieces. I'm going to convert them into construction lines because that's just what they are now, are my construction lines. And now I can go ahead and sort of fillet these two corners. Fillet this corner here and fillet this corner. Let's say 1 is fine, maybe 1.5, we'll make it a little bit bigger. And so it's nice and smooth across there. I'm going to do it for this side as well. Fillet this corner here, fillet this corner here. You can see that these two are actually two different dimensions right now. I'm going to leave it as two different dimensions because I'm going to show you that there's probably a better way of doing this, but the only way that I figured out how to do this is now I want to define what this radius is. I can actually click on that and I can define it as this dimension here by clicking on it, which is D4. I can type in D4 or I can just click on that and you can see it's updated this to be D4. And so when I hit enter, it was sort of like constrain it to this same dimension, right? Because now if I change it to 1, it updates because this is actually referencing this dimension here. So that way, again, everything is nice and sort of like symmetrical for us. Let's go ahead and make this, turn this back to something a little bit bigger because I like that sort of like smooth curve. That looks like it's okay. It's a little bit big for what we're trying to do. Let's go ahead and make this maybe just a tad smaller. Let's change this to 2 millimeters and let's make this maybe 3. And let's start with that, all right? We'll sort of play with it as we go along, but I think that looks a little bit better for what we are trying to do for our waffle knob. And that is the majority, that should do it for our sort of sketch here. We can finish our sketch. And now that we have our main sketch, we can actually start to manipulate this or turn this into a 3-dimensional solid. So we have our 2D drawing. We're going to extrude this to turn it into a solid, right? So I click on extrude. I click on the body that I want, the sketch that I want, and it's automatically sort of figured out this is what I want to extrude. We found out earlier that we want to make it about 10 millimeters. So I'm going to hit 10 millimeters and there's our solid, all right? So here's our big solid. And again, we could have just left it like this and then probably cut out the internal circle for this key, but because I want to be able to add a few more features and make this a little bit more compelling as a design, I'm actually going to sort of hollow this thing out and sort of like make a shell of this instead, and then add in these ribs afterwards. So again, always multiple ways of doing things. I could have gone back to my sketch, right? I could have gone back to my sketch and sort of like offset this circle and then out and then just sort of extruded the shell of it. But because I think there are easier tools of making that shell is literally a shell command. So if I go to modify, there is a shell command that I have. So shell, click on the surface that I want to eliminate, which is this top surface. It's asking me how thick I want to make the shell. And I think maybe 1.5 millimeters might be good. Right? You can see that there. Again, if I want to change it later, it's easy to change it. But part of what's nice about it being parametric is I can go back and sort of update these things fairly quickly, right? So I can go back and say like 1.5 isn't really, maybe I need to make it a little bit thicker because of how thick everything is going to be. And I can change that to 2 and then just sort of thicken that up if I need to thicken that up, right? So again, double click this, go back maybe and leave it at 1.5 for now, and then we'll see how that is. So that will sort of bring us to, so that gives us our main geometry for our shell and our knob. From there, we'll add the other features in the next little part here. Okay, so one thing that I forgot to do earlier was actually name my sketches, right? It's really important to keep things organized as we're going along because obviously we're going to be building off of these things and then we'll have to go back and refer to it. So I'm going to name this or rename this so that when I need to come back to it or refer back to it, I know what we're talking about. So this is our base. I'm just going to call it our base, and then we're good to go. All right. So now that we've done that, you can see in our timeline too, right? In our timeline, that's our base. And so now we have that, and we are good to go. Next thing we're going to do, we're going to work on, we could either do this sort of like key here, or we can do our ribs. But we're going to go and do our ribs first because, I don't know, I just want to work on the ribs first. So to do that, as always, as I said before, we're going to do a sketch before we extrude and modify it. So I'm going to make another sketch. And so this case, you can see that it's again, as always, it's asking me what construction plane I want to work off of. And so I can, again, use sort of the bottom construction plane, right, on the XY construction plane. But what I really want to do, because I know that I want to continue to build off of this sort of bottom plate here of the shell. And then if I move this later, right, if I thicken this, I want to make sure that it still continues to reference this plane and sort of move it with it. So I'm going to actually select this plane to make sure that that's what it's referencing when I make my ribs, right? So so now it brings it up, and you can see that that now refers to, we are now using this sort of geometry as our reference plane. Okay, so in order to make our ribs, what we're trying to do, as always, is make this symmetrical across these axes. And in order to do that, I'm going to set up a couple reference lines for myself. So as usual, start with the origin, make a line like that. I'm going to turn this into a construction line so that I have something to reference. Okay, because I'm going to make it symmetrical across that axis. I'm going to draw another reference line. This time I'm going to just sort of draw it off to the side, just sort of simply off to the side somewhere. And then again, turn this into a reference or a construction line, our reference line, and those are our two reference lines. So again, from here, there are many ways of sort of like achieving the same goal. The way that I'm going to do this is by sort of extruding this or offsetting this reference line so that I have two sort of like edges of my rib. I could also make a rectangle and sort of like extrude that rectangle, but I don't really, there's some weird sort of geometry that happens when you do that. So instead, what I'm going to do is take this line and I'm going to offset that line by going to offset, clicking that, and then we get our first offset line, right? So now that I have that offset line, I'm actually going to try to extend these things so that it's coincident with this mark or with this circle. But I can't quite do that yet because you have this constraint here that's keeping me from actually like manipulating these things, right? So I can like rotate this, but I can't really sort of like change it because it's being referencing to this line. So I guess if I move this back and forth, I could do that. But what I want to actually happen is that this point here, I want to be coincident to this circle. So I'm going to release this constraint by clicking on it and just deleting that specific constraint. And so now I'm free to adjust these endpoints as I need, right? So now you can see that I can sort of make these changes a little bit more freely, right? And so what I want to do now is make this point coincident to this circle. You can see it snapped to there. And then now I also want this point to also be coincident to this circle, and how now it's sort of like now is sort of like perfectly along that edge, which is exactly what I want to have happen, right? Because if I continue to, when I change this dimension here, say if I want to make this a lot wider, right? I still want this to be coincident to this circle. If it wasn't coincident to this circle, it'll actually cut into the shell here, which it doesn't actually really matter that much for how the program sort of handles all these sort of like shapes and geometries. But just to make things a little bit more clean, I just want to make sure that it's coincident to these things so that it just sort of finishes nicely, right? So anyway, now we have that line there. We want to sort of mirror it across here so that obviously we have a nice sort of like rectangle or a rib that we can work off of. So as usual, I'm going to click on that line. I'm going to mirror it. I'm going to select the mirror line, which is the reference line that we drew earlier. We'll say OK, and we are good to go. All right. So again, now I have these 2 points. As I rotate it, you can see that it remains coincident to one another and parallel to one another, as well as being able to change these dimensions to make it thicker or wider as we need. All right. And so we're good there. The last thing we're going to do is, again, because I want this to be I want to mirror this across here so that it's nice and symmetrical. I'm going to do the same thing where I take my 2 points or 2 lines and mirror it. And this time the mirror line is this first one that I set up earlier. Hit OK. And so now you can see it's nice. It's nice that I have all these points and I can rotate these nice and freely, right? And I continue to sort of like, I can continue to thicken these if I want and make these ribs bigger or smaller depending on sort of like how much structure that I need later, right? One last thing that I'm going to try to do is, again, I can just sort of like eyeball these sort of like the sort of angle here, right? Which is fine, but I'm going to add one more constraint to these 2 construction lines that I made earlier. That way I can sort of define exactly what that angle is going to be. If I click on measure, I can sort of define this angle. And so now when I define that angle, again, it just gives me another set of controls to sort of manipulate this as we go along, right? Whether I want this sort of more shallow or more sort of like acute, I can just sort of change this on the fly as we go along. Okay, so now that we have the sketch per usual, I'm going to finish my sketch. I'm going to rename my sketch so I keep this nice and organized. So this time I'm going to rename, and I'm going to rename it the ribs. And so now I have that. now that I have my 2D sketch done, I can extrude them so that I have my solid ribs. And so I'm going to go ahead and extrude, click on my extrude tool. Again, I can reference these I can reference these points or reference the geometry that I made earlier, right? I want this one, this one, this one, and this one, and this one, which again, what Fusion does a really good job of just sort of like deciding what you want to do, right? What's really nice about sort of drawing all these things is that you actually don't have to be super precise when you make your initial sketches, right? Because you can kind of come through and just kind of pick what you want to make happen. And then when you turn it into a solid, and then you can sort of manipulate it from there. So that's why for a lot of parts, like that's why there was a lot of things where I just kind of sort of sketched as I went along, because it didn't really matter that much. Right. So anyway, now that I've selected the objects that I wanted, there's a couple different features that I want to sort of like keep in, that I want to sort of like highlight, right? So as usual, I could just sort of define what that dimension or that height is. So I know that this is like, this height was 10 inches earlier, and then this shell was maybe 1.5. And so I could just subtract those two things and say like 8.5, so that this sort of like evens or sort of lands flush to this ring. But what's much easier is I can actually reference that. So if I go to my toolbox here, I can choose how far, right now it's set on distance, but I'm going to choose to extrude to the object, and I'm going to select the object being this face, and then voila, right? So now it sort of like clicks to there, and you can see how it's just sort of extruded to that top face, which is nice. So again, if I go back and change the height of this geometry later, it will also change the height of that, and everything will be nice and set, and I don't necessarily have to go back and sort of like do the calculations again, right? One last thing that I actually want to do is like, I actually don't want it to go all the way to the face. I actually want to sort of have it recede a little bit. That way there's just a little less friction on the surface of on the surface, right? So less things to sort of get caught. So I'm actually going to, I'm going to offset the top a little bit, just by -1 millimeter or maybe 1.5 millimeters. That way it just sort of recedes back just a little bit, right? The other thing that I'm doing in terms of the operation, I want to join it together. That way it's all one object, right? Because eventually when I go to 3D print this thing, I want this all to be one object. And so I'm going to actually join these all together so that it's one. Hit OK, and there we go. We have our sort of ribs and our main shell all put in place. And if we need to, eventually we can go back and sort of do these manipulations. I'm going to probably... I feel like this sort of like angle is a little too severe. I don't really like that angle very much. So let's go back into the sketch real quickly and change that angle. Let's make this a little bit wider. Maybe let's do 50 degrees. And that looks a little bit better. I like that. Let's do that. Finish my sketch. And again, what's nice is that everything just sort of automatically updates. I don't have to go back and sort of like do a bunch of sort of like edits. Just do that one sort of like change that one parameter and we are good to go. So that looks good. Let's do, and yeah, so that's good. We're going to work on our little key next. All right, so now that we have our ribs, we can go ahead and add our key to our waffle knob here, right? So just like as usual, what we need to do is start a sketch. And there's a couple different ways that we can go about doing this. So right now, if we start a sketch, what you'll notice is that because we have the ribs in place here, it breaks apart all these different features into these different sort of like regions, right? And that's fine, we can do that. So let's, and I'll show you that first, even though I don't really like doing that. So let's go ahead and click that first and see that, all right, we can go ahead and work on that. But as you can see, having this sort of rib here in place, like sure, we can draw over it, but it's just sort of like messy, right? And there's a lot of things in the way. One way that we can deal with that is actually projecting. So if I go to create and click on project, I can actually project this sort of like this exterior. I can even just collect this line if I wanted to, but if I select this face and project that to my construction plane, I can have that as a reference, and then I can turn off the body, and then now I have a much cleaner sort of workspace to work off of, right? And so that's definitely one way to do it, but you can see that it still breaks it up into these sort of like smaller regions, which I don't love. So let's go ahead and do this another way. I'm gonna just kind of like undo back a couple times and show you a different way of doing this. So the way that I'm going to do this instead is actually going to use this timeline down here, which is again a really nice feature where you get to actually, you know, decide that, all right, well, I made these ribs already. I don't want to sort of delete them. So instead, maybe what I should have done is actually made the key first. So what I can do is literally go back in time to before I made that sketch, right? It's still saved. It hasn't gone anywhere. And instead, I'm going to essentially do, right? I'm essentially going to just build that key first. as if that I never sort of thought about what was going to happen with the ribs and just sort of build off of that. So let's go ahead and do that instead. Let's start my sketch again. This time I can just go ahead and select that same face as we did before. And it takes me back to this feature where I have a nice open workspace that we can sort of build off of, right? So as usual, this is going to be a pretty simple geometry. There's not much to it. We have the dimensions that we got from the physical object earlier. So we'll make a circle coincident to the origin, nice and simple. We know that the diameter is going to be 6 millimeters, so we can type in 6. Voila, nice and easy. The next thing that we want to do is add this sort of flat element to keep the potentiometer from spinning on itself, or actually the knob spinning on the potentiometer and actually allowing it to turn. The way that I'm going to do that is I'm going to add a center constraint line. So I draw my line, and I'm going to draw it from coincident where it should meet the sort of y-axis. I'm going to draw that up and enter 4.75, hit that, and that should be hopefully constrained to those points. I want this to be a construction line, leave that as there. And then so that should be good. It's constrained vertical, so hopefully that all of that stuff stays in place. I'm going to add this line, this horizontal line across, so that it is coincident with the circle again. And also perpendicular, which is nice. I'm going to now extend it so that it hits all the way across. I can click on extend. Where is my extend tool? My extend tool should be up here somewhere. Modify, extend, and extend this line, and it should automatically read to that circle. So we're good. I want to delete this part because I really just want this region. So I can go ahead and trim that away, and we are left with just the key that we want. So from here, what we can do is, so now that this is that region, that's the interior region, we need the shell on the outside, right? So in order to do that, I'm going to offset this so that I have a nice sort of shell to work with. So I'm going to click on my offset tool, select the region that I want, and then I'm going to, for now, just sort of offset at that 1 millimeter. I think that might be okay. I probably actually want it a little bit bigger than that, but let's leave it at that for now. And that's our 1 millimeter. So as usual, because it's parametric, I can change this at will and sort of like adjust this. One of the things that I noticed while I was trying to practice doing this earlier is that for whatever reason, like I know that I want to rotate this eventually, right? Like we talked about before, it's not going to be perfectly vertical or horizontal. It's going to be some angle, and I probably want to be able to adjust that pretty easily. For whatever reason, I noticed that when I rotate this element here, it breaks this constraint, and I can't just easily offset it anymore. So I'm not sure why that is happening. Instead, I'm going to add a couple of my own constraints just so that I can fix that more easily in the past. So I'm going to delete that constraint, right? And I'm going to delete these offset constraints so that now these elements are sort of free to do their own thing, okay? But I still want to make sure that they're acting together. I still want them to, I don't want to have to go through and manipulate a bunch of different sort of like parameters. So I'm going to go back and add a constraint, dimension constraint here and here, right? And then I'm going to also add a dimension constraint for here to here. And then I'm going to use my trick that I did last time, where essentially I'm going to define this dimension to be the same as this dimension. So I can click on this, and right, you can see that it's going to refer to this dimension here, and hit enter. So now when I change this dimension, it will automatically update this as well. Again, I don't know why it breaks it when I rotate it, but that's the fix that I decided to use in order for me to adapt to this. So I could go back in, as I said, I want to be able to rotate this to make the adjustments as we go along. And I can go through and add a couple sort of like dimension or sort of like construction lines and then make the angles, but it's probably just easier if I literally just select this whole thing, go up to my modify tool, and then rotate this, right? And then just based on that, I can just sort of rotate it as I need. And then looking at what we said earlier from my really rough estimation, I think it's fair to just sort of start with 45 degrees. We'll just start with 45 degrees. And now that I'm looking at this, I probably have to actually rotate this around because we're looking at the underside. So let's actually rotate this the other way, 45 degrees. So negative 45 degrees around this way. So negative 45 degrees is negative 90 there. Hit enter, and then now when we flip it over, yeah, I think that makes more sense. So we are pretty good there. So like I said, that's a pretty simple one, pretty straightforward. Let's go ahead and finish our sketch and make the modifications to our extrusion. So I'll finish my sketch, go back to my home view. And then again, what's really nice about all of this is that, like I said, I just literally inserted that before I made the ribs, right? And I can just sort of skip forward and my ribs are still there. I haven't had to change anything. Everything is still there. It's still good. It's a nice little feature that allows me to like, oops, I made a mistake before. I can just go back and just sort of update that. So let's change our sketch name as usual to make sure that we have all of this stuff in line and organized. I'm going to change this to key, hit enter, and we're good there. So the next thing we're going to do, as we did before, is actually make the extrusion. But before we make the extrusion, we actually want to clear a little bit of a space here, right? The ribs are obviously in the way. We don't want that to sort of interfere. We want that to be a nice open space so that I'll be able to actually insert the potentiometer in there. So what I'm going to do is still an extrusion, right? I'm still going to do an extrusion, but the difference that we're going to do in one of the parameters is one, I'm going to select both this and this, right? And then when I extrude to an object, I'm actually going to select this surface because I want it to be, or actually this surface, sorry. I'm going to select to this surface so that it sort of clears that space for me, right? And you can see the difference between what I did before is actually I'm going to cut this instead of join this. So when I cut this, you can see the difference is that it essentially makes a hole in the center for me there. And so now I have space to go back in and add the actual key for where the potentiometer will sit into it. I need to bring back the sketch that we did earlier. So turn that back on. I'm going to extrude that one more time. This time I'm just going to extrude that offset, and then I want to extrude it to the face of this surface. And then this time, like I said, instead we're going to join it so that it becomes part of this whole object. Hit OK, and there we go. And then now we should have the majority of our waffle knob, right? We have the main part, the main components. We have our base, we have our little pointer, we have our ribs, we have our key. There's a few more things that we want to try to do just to again add a few more sort of like nice features to it. But honestly, we can probably print this, check it, check some of the dimensions, see where it's at, and then go from there. But before that, we'll do a couple more things, including the little surprise that I had earlier before we send this to the 3D printer. All right, we are almost done with this waffle knob. We are almost ready to print. There's only a few last features that I want to add, and then we should be good to go. So the last major one will be the little flange that I always keep forgetting to add, but we'll add that real quickly. We'll add a couple fillets to make sure that it just is the geometry is a little bit more smooth and a little easier to handle. And I got this last little feature that feature surprise that I would like to include. So let's go ahead and quickly add this flange. Let's do our sketch per usual. I'm going to use this top surface because that's where I want it to land. This geometry is going to be pretty straightforward. I'm going to add my center point because it's going to be symmetrical. Turn this into a construction line. From that construction line, I'm going to then add another line that is coincident to the outside circle. I want to mirror that across my center line that I added earlier. Oops, I'm going to mirror that. First, I'm going to select the object that I want. Then I want to select the mirror line. Hit OK. Object is this thing, and we should be good to go. What I want to do is now, I want to be able, I actually don't want this entire surface. I just want kind of like half of this thing. So what I'm going to do is make an arc and offset that arc. I'm going to go to create an arc. I want to use this 3 center point one so that I can click the center here. Go to this point that's coincident to that arm, and then coincident to that arm, and now I have my arc, which I can then offset. And then I will offset it, let's say 0.5 is probably good, maybe a little bit more, let's say 0.75. Let's start with 0.75. These are going to be construction lines because I don't want them to interfere with the actual geometry, right? But I do need lines so that I can close off this region so that I can extrude it later. So let's go ahead and just add that line there. Oops. Add that line there. Did I add a line? I don't know. I didn't. I'm going to add that line that is constrained to this point and that and then this point to that point, and we should be good to go with that. Last thing I'm going to add this angle in here so that I can change the width of that really quickly. So select this angle arm, select this arm. It should automatically know that I want to make that into an angle. Let's make this a little bit smaller. Let's say 25 degrees, maybe even smaller. Maybe let's start with 20 degrees, and then that's good. That's all that we need to do for our flange sketch. Because once we're done with that, we should be able to rename this flange, and then when I go to extrude, I can go ahead and simply select that region. Let's say 1 millimeter is probably good, and then we have our flange. That still looks a little bit wide. So let's go back into our sketch real quickly, change this to 15 degrees. Yeah, 15 degrees. We'll start with that, see what happens, and then we'll go from there. Cool. So we have our flange. We're good. That's probably all our major geometry. Now we're just going to fill out a couple of these corners, like I said, so that the geometry is just a little easier or a little nicer to touch and hold. Let's fillet these outside corners. I'm going to select my fillet tool. I'm going to select these outside curves because I want them to be the same. So when I select the same objects, they'll all stay in the timeline together. So if I want to go back to update that, it'll actually be a lot easier because then I don't have to reselect it. It'll just kind of know what I want to do. The edge, let's say 0.5 millimeters. Yeah, 0.5 millimeters looks good. Let's say 0.5 millimeters. The other ones that I want to fillet are actually all these inside corners. I don't really have to fillet these inside corners, but generally speaking, having the fillet around these sort of like hard edges does make it a little bit more robust, especially when we're 3D printing. Any sort of sharp edges has a tendency to want to break. I doubt that this is going to break, but just for caution's sake, I'm going to go ahead and fillet those corners as well. I'm going to select all these corners. It's going to be a little annoying to go through and select all these corners, but it'll be worth it because if I need to update it later, I can just go ahead and go back into my timeline, and it will be much simpler to just select that operation in the timeline because it will save all of it later. You can actually go back and sort of like update your selection afterwards as well if you just sort of like forgot something. But I'm going to go ahead and try to select them all this first time around. One more, a couple more here. One more here, select. We're almost done. We have all our features selected. I'm going to choose, let's call this 1.5 millimeters. How does that look? I think that looks pretty good. It could be a little bit wider, but for now, like I said, I think that'll be fine for what we're trying to do. We don't want to have to go crazy. The last little one that I'm going to add is actually fillet in this corner because this is probably the most important one because the potentiometer is going to actually fit in there, and we could probably sort of force it in there, but having a nice fillet will at least give that a little bit more guidance and make it hopefully a little easier to fit later. So I'm going to select this corner. I'm going to select this edge just because, and I think I'm also going to make it 0.5 millimeters. Actually, that's too big. Let's say 0.25 millimeters, and that should be good. Right? So that is the majority of our design there. We should be just about ready to go with the 3D print. The last little thing, all right, so the surprise that I've been talking about this whole time, because we are making this from scratch and doing our own thing, it's always nice to be able to add a little bit of personalization. So I'm going to add, not a canvas, I am going to add a little SVG, of, let's see, that's my little hedgehog, right? I'm going to select my bottom face to work with and rotate my plane around so that so I have my little hedgehog, right? So those of you guys who know me, the hedgehog is the little symbol that I have for my wife because she can be a little on the prickly side. And so I'm going to add this little hedgehog in there for her so that it is embossed and a little bit more personalized, and I think it's a fun little feature, right? Always nice to be able to add something that lets you know that it is one of a kind. So I'm going to just try to get this to fit nicely on there. I think that looks about good, right? That looks good. We'll hit enter. Let's go back and extrude that up, right? Let's rename this to be hedgehog. And then we can extrude that, or finish our sketch first, and then we can extrude that feature. Let's extrude that feature. I'm going to make that 0.5, and I want to cut it, so it looks like I'm going to actually have to make it negative 0.5 so that it can negative 0.5. to cut inside of that cap of our knob, and you can see that it sort of cuts that or embosses it underneath it, so that when it 3D prints, we'll have that hollowed out, and we should be able to have our sort of like knob. So yeah, I think we're just about done with all of this. We have all our major features. It's already set up to be parametric, so I'm sure that we'll go back and maybe have to adjust either this size, or maybe you want to give it a little bit more structure. But we'll worry about that after we 3D print it for the first time and sort of like check it. But yeah, that's going to do it for now. In our next episode, we'll actually go through and actually 3D print this, but that should be all the CAD to get us set up. All right, thanks for watching. I'll catch you next time.